In the Wild West, life often measured a woman's worth in youth, beauty, and children. By those standards, Clara was forgotten. At 50, she had been rejected, mocked, and left to live in silence. For decades, she carried the weight of loneliness like an old coat bearing her longings beneath daily chores and nights where no one ever said her name with tenderness. What most people would never see were the countless evenings she sat by the fire, wondering if love had simply passed her by. That was her tragedy, not one sudden blow, but a lifetime of being told she was too plain, too barren, too old to matter. And then one spring evening, as the cottonwoods stirred in the wind and dusk laid its soft hand across her porch, Clara let slip the secret she had never dared to voice: "I've never been kissed." The words hung in the air, trembling, almost shameful, until the cowboy beside her, Jonas, slowly removed his hat, placed it on his knee, and said with a voice steady as a mountain river, "Then let's start slow." That simple answer was like a match struck in the dark. The crowd of her past rejections, the years of silence, seemed to hush. For the first time, she wasn't being judged, pitied, or cast aside. She was being seen. But what happened after? Would Clara allow herself to believe that love could still bloom after 50 years of solitude? Could Jonas, carrying his own scars and losses, truly give her the tenderness she had been denied for so long? This is not the story of young love burning bright and fast. It is the story of love that comes late, love that heals, love that grows steady like spring grass after frost. And as the night deepened with stars bending low over the prairie, one question lingered in the air: when two hearts scarred by silence finally risk opening, what happens next? The wind carried the scent of dust and wild sage across the lonely plains of New Mexico. The land stretched wide and quiet, stitched together with fences, leaning tired against time. In a small cabin at the edge of a withering creek lived Clara Mayfield, a woman of 50 years, who had learned through long practice how to fold silence into her life until it became as natural as breathing. Her days were steady, filled with small rituals: feeding the hens, patching worn clothes, tending to a meager garden that clung stubbornly to life in the hard soil. She moved carefully, as if the world might scold her for making too much noise. Clara had been many things in her life: a dutiful daughter, an unwanted bride, a woman left behind. She had been spoken over, spoken for, and sometimes not spoken to at all. And though she carried herself with dignity, she could not hide the deep river of loneliness that carved at her heart with every passing season. Neighbors in town whispered behind her back, "She's too old for new beginnings, too plain for a suitor, too quiet to be noticed." She pretended not to hear, but at night, lying on her narrow bed, their words echoed in the rafters above her. What hurt Clara most was not the loneliness itself, but the truth she had never spoken aloud in all her 50 years, through marriage and abandonment, through duty and survival. She had never been kissed, not truly, not tenderly, not in the way that told a person, "You matter, you are cherished." She had once dreamed of it. As a girl, she used to imagine a gentle touch under the starlit sky, a voice whispering her name as though it was the only word that mattered. But life had demanded her strength, her silence, her service, and in giving all those things, she had lost the chance for softness. On this particular evening, the sun spilled gold across the horizon, burning the sky with fire before it sank into the hills. Clara leaned against the porch rail, the wood rough beneath her hands, and wondered if the rest of her days would look just like this: chore, silence, and the endless ache of what might have been. The road that ran past her land had long been empty. Few strangers came this way unless they were lost or running from something. But tonight the sound of hooves carried faintly through the air. Clara straightened, her heart quickening in a way she couldn't explain. From the rise of the hill came a lone rider. His figure was cut sharp against the dying light, tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with the dust of miles on his coat. The closer he rode, the more Clara could see the weariness in his posture, but also the steadiness in his movements, like a man who had lived through storms and learned how to stand firm against them. He slowed his horse at the edge of her fence, lifted a hand in greeting, and spoke in a voice low and warm, carrying across the quiet evening. "Ma'am, I mean no harm, just passing through. But I saw smoke from your chimney. Thought maybe there was a kind soul who could spare a sip of water." Clara's throat tightened. Strangers rarely stopped here, men even less so. She hesitated, fingers brushing the old rifle leaning by the doorframe. The man must have noticed her caution because he tipped his hat, slowly revealing eyes the color of river stones, steady, clear, and somehow kind. Something inside Clara shifted a small flicker, like the first light of dawn breaking across a long night. She didn't know his name nor why he had come, but for the first time in years she felt her silence stir. And that night, without realizing it, the story of her heart, a story she thought had ended long ago, quietly began again. Would you like to see what happens when Clara opens her door to the stranger? The rider dismounted slowly, his boots pressing into the dust, with the quiet weight of someone who respected the land beneath him. He looped the reins of his horse over the fence post, giving the animal a gentle pat on the neck, before turning back toward Clara. "Name's Jonas Hale," he said, voice steady, but not imposing. "Been riding near 2 days with little more than cold beans in my saddlebag. I don't mean to trouble you, ma'am. Just need water for me and the horse. Then I'll be on my way." Clara's fingers tightened against the porch rail. Every sensible part of her told her to keep her distance, to guard herself as she always had. Yet there was something in his tone, not desperate, not demanding, that disarmed her. She cleared her throat, her voice scratchy from disuse. "Well, water I can manage." She stepped down the hem of her faded dress, brushing the earth. At the well near the barn, Clara worked the handle, the rope groaning as the bucket rose full. Jonas took it carefully, letting his horse drink first before he bent to drink himself. He didn't gulp like a starving man. He drank slow, grateful, as though even water was a gift to be savored. Clara studied him quietly. His coat was worn but mended with care. His hat rim bent from years of weather. His face carved with lines that told of hard days but not cruelty. His eyes, though, they held something she hadn't seen in a long while. Not pity, not judgment, just a quiet recognition, as though he knew the weight of solitude himself. "You live out here alone?" Jonas asked after a moment, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "For some years now." He glanced toward the cabin, then back at her. "Takes grit to keep a place going on your own. More grit than most men I've met." No one had ever said that to her before. Folks in town muttered about her stubbornness, her oddity, but grit, that sounded almost like respect. Clara felt a strange warmth rise in her chest, one she quickly smothered beneath the old habits of modesty. She motioned toward the cabin. "I've stew on the fire. Rabbit and potatoes. If you're hungry." Jonas's eyes softened, though he didn't move closer until she stepped first toward the door. Inside the cabin smelled faintly of herbs and wood smoke. It was small but tidy, the kind of space shaped by hands that cared even when no one else was watching. They sat at the table, bowls steaming before them. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she poured, unaccustomed to the company. Jonas noticed but said nothing, only bowed his head briefly before eating. He ate slowly like the water, each bite measured, grateful. For a long time silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the heavy silence Clara had lived with for years. It was gentler, like two streams running side by side, not yet joined, but not rushing apart either. Finally, Jonas set his spoon down. His voice was low, almost reverent. "Feels strange sitting at a table again. Been a long time since I shared a meal that wasn't with the road for company." Clara looked up, meeting his gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of loneliness, of endurance, of two lives shaped by loss, yet still quietly hoping. Her lips parted before she could stop herself. "Then maybe you should stay another day." The words startled her. She hadn't meant to invite him, not so soon. But once spoken, they hung in the air, fragile as glass. Jonas tilted his head, studying her with those steady riverstone eyes. He didn't smile wide, but a small, grateful curve touched his lips. "If you'd have me, ma'am, I reckon I'd be honored." And for the first time in years, Clara felt the silence of her cabin shift, not broken, but filled with the possibility of something more. But what happens when Clara's guarded heart begins to wrestle with the kindness Jonas offers? The days slipped into a rhythm Clara had not expected. Jonas stayed. At first it was just one night, then another, then a week. Each day he found a chore to take on without her asking. He mended the north fence that had leaned like an old drunk for months. He sharpened her hoe until it cut through soil smooth as silk. He even coaxed her mule into behaving, no small miracle. Clara told herself it was temporary. Men like him never stayed. Drifters passed through, they didn't plant roots. And yet, every morning when she woke to the sound of his boots in the yard, she felt something in her chest loosen, something she hadn't realized had been clenched tight for years. But with that loosening came fear. One evening they sat on the porch. The field stretched wide, washed in the pink glow of sunset. Jonas sat a step below her, whittling a piece of pine, his hat tipped low. Clara had been mending a shirt, but her needle stilled in her hand. She kept sneaking glances at him, wondering what it would mean if he left, and worse, what it would mean if he stayed. "You're quiet tonight," Jonas said, his eyes still on the wood in his hand. Clara pressed her lips together, uncertain. Words never came easy to her, especially not when they touched the tender places. "I don't much have the habit of talking," she murmured. Jonas looked up then, and for a moment their eyes locked. His gaze wasn't pressing, just steady. "Don't need to be in the habit, just need to mean it when you do." Clara felt her cheeks warm. She dropped her eyes to her mending, but her hands shook and the thread knotted. That night when Jonas retired to the barn, Clara lay awake in her narrow bed. The cabin felt too small, too alive, with the memory of his voice, the way his presence filled empty spaces without crowding her. She turned on her side, her back to the fire's glow, but her thoughts refused to settle. The truth was, Jonas's kindness stirred something dangerous in her, a longing she had long buried. She had been told once, long ago, that she wasn't the sort of woman men wanted. Not pretty enough, not soft enough, too old, too scarred by years of silence and toil. She had believed it, built her life around it. And yet when Jonas looked at her, she sometimes forgot. That forgetting scared her more than the loneliness ever had. The next morning, Clara avoided him. She busied herself in the garden, pulling weeds until her hands ached. Jonas came by with a bucket of water, setting it down beside her. "You've been at it since sunup," he said. "I've work to do," she replied curtly, keeping her eyes on the soil. He stood there a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right." He didn't push. He never did. But the gentleness in his restraint made her chest tighten with guilt. All day Clara wrestled with herself. She wanted him near, his presence steady like the mountains that held back storms. But every time she felt herself leaning closer, a voice inside whispered, "Don't be a fool. Men leave. Men wound. You'll only break again." That evening, Clara found herself staring at the fire while Jonas sat carving by the table. The silence stretched thick and heavy this time, not easy as before. Finally, Jonas set the knife down. His voice was quiet, careful. "I reckon I've stayed longer than I planned." Clara's breath caught. Her throat felt dry. "Then maybe you ought to be on your way." The words tumbled out sharper than she meant. Jonas studied her. His face gave little away, but something flickered in his eyes. Hurt, maybe, or just weary acceptance. He stood pulling his coat from the chair. "If that's what you want," he said simply. Clara's heart screamed. No, but her lips pressed shut. He walked toward the door, her hands clenched into fists. She had lived alone for so long, survived every disappointment by telling herself it was safer not to hope, safer not to reach. And here he was, a man offering nothing but patience, and she was sending him away. Her voice broke from her before she could stop it. "Wait." Jonas paused, hand on the latch. She swallowed hard, her body trembling. I don't know how to do this." He turned back slowly, his eyes softening. "Do what, Clara?" Her shoulders sagged. "Let someone close. Trust it won't turn against me. Trust I won't be left behind again." Jonas stepped closer, but not too close. He kept a respectful distance, his tone low, steady as always. "You don't have to know how. You just have to want to try." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. She shook her head, whispering, "But I'm too old for foolish hopes. Too worn. Too—" Jonas removed his hat, then holding it in front of him, like he might in church. His voice carried quiet reverence. "Clara, I've seen men with more land than they knew what to do with, more silver in their pockets than sense. Not a one of them had half your strength. You think being older makes you less. To me, it just means you've walked through fire and still got the grace to offer stew to a stranger." Clara stared at him, her chest aching with something she couldn't name. He continued, softer now. "I ain't here to take anything from you. I'm just asking for the chance to sit at your table, to walk beside you. Slow, if that's what you need." The words wrapped around her like a quilt she hadn't realized she needed. Her fear didn't vanish, but it shifted, softened, made room for something else. She looked down, voice barely more than a whisper. I've never even been kissed, Jonas. Silence hung for a heartbeat. Then Jonas set his hat gently on the table. He stepped close enough that she could feel his presence, steady as a mountain, but he didn't reach for her. Instead, his voice came low and certain. Then we'll start slow. Clara's heart pounded, not with dread this time, but with the fragile flutter of hope. She didn't know if she could give him everything. She didn't know if she could keep from stumbling on old scars. But for the first time in decades, she wanted to try. But what happens when Clara's fear collides with her yearning, when the past still whispers louder than the present? The morning broke with a thin veil of mist curling over the cottonwoods. Clara rose early as she always did to tend the chickens. But something felt different in her chest, lighter, unsteady but not from fear, from possibility. Jonas was already outside splitting logs. The steady rhythm of his axe striking wood echoed across the yard. Clara watched him for a moment from the porch. His movements weren't rushed. He worked with care, every swing purposeful. There was no vanity in it, no show, just a man doing what needed doing. When he noticed her watching Jonas pause, leaning on the axe handle, "Morning," he called, voice warm. "Morning," she replied, clutching her shawl tighter. He gave her a small nod, then bent back to his work. The sight steadied her in a way she didn't expect. For years, her mornings had been silent chores, done with only her own breath for company. Now each sound he made folded into the day, turning loneliness into rhythm. That evening after supper, Clara found herself restless. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting shadows across the cabin walls. Jonas sat at the table, oiling his rifle. She sat in her chair sewing, but the thread slipped in her hands. Finally, she set her work aside. "Jonas," she said softly. He looked up, waiting. "I meant what I said last night. I've never been kissed. Not once. Not in 50 years of living." The words trembled, but she forced them out. Jonas set the rifle aside carefully. His eyes held no mockery, no surprise, only patience. "Then maybe it's about time," he said. Clara's breath caught. "I don't know if I can." "You don't have to," he said. "Not until you want it. I told you we'll start slow." Something inside her broke free then. All the years of being told she was too plain, too old, too barren, unworthy of affection. All the years of silence that had wrapped around her heart like rope. For once she wanted to loosen it. Just a little. She rose from her chair, her knees unsteady. Jonas stood too, not rushing, giving her space. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," Clara whispered. "You don't have to be," he said. "Not with me." She stepped closer until the warmth of him brushed against her. Her hand trembled as she reached up, touching his shoulder. Jonas didn't move, didn't press. He simply waited, his presence steady as a mountain. Clara closed her eyes. "Just don't laugh." Jonas's voice came low, almost tender. "Darling, the only thing I feel right now is honored." Her breath shivered out, and slowly, carefully, she lifted her chin. Jonas leaned down, not to claim, not to rush, but to meet her where she stood. His lips brushed hers, feather light. Barely there. A promise more than a kiss. Clara's eyes stung with tears. She had braced herself for awkwardness, for shame. But instead she felt warmth spread through her chest, soft and steady. It wasn't fire. It wasn't hunger. It was gentleness. A kindness she had never known. When they parted, Jonas searched her eyes. "How was that?" Clara's lips trembled into a smile. Like rain after a long drought. They sat by the fire after that, side by side. Clara's shoulder brushed his arm, and for the first time she didn't pull away. She let herself rest there just a little. Jonas said nothing, simply slid his hand palm up on his knee. Slowly she placed her hand in his, their fingers twining together like roots finding soil. The silence was no longer heavy. It was alive. Over the days that followed, Clara felt something shift within her. Jonas still worked as he always had, fixing fences, tending the animals, carrying buckets from the well. But now he lingered closer, as if each chore was a chance to build not just her homestead, but something between them. One afternoon, as they mended the chicken coop roof, Clara slipped on the ladder rung. Her foot caught and she gasped. Before panic could rise, Jonas was there, steadying her waist with one strong hand. You all right? He asked. Her heart hammered, but not from fear. From the nearness of him, the security of that touch. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. I think so. He didn't let go right away. His hand lingered, not claiming, just steadying. Then gently he released her as if to say, you can stand on your own, but I'll be here if you fall. It was the smallest thing, but for Clara it felt like freedom. One evening as the sun dipped low, Clara and Jonas walked out to the edge of her field. The land stretched wide and golden, the mountains etched against the horizon. Clara folded her arms looking out. I used to think this land was a burden, she admitted, a reminder of what I lost. But now, she hesitated. Jonas glanced at her quiet. Now she exhaled a long breath, carrying years of weight. Now it feels like a beginning. Jonas's hand brushed hers. That's because you're not carrying it alone anymore. Clara looked at him, then really looked at the lines of wear on his face, the quiet sadness in his eyes, but also the steady strength, the patience that had held her fear without flinching. And she realized something: Jonas wasn't saving her. He was simply standing with her, offering her the choice to step out of the shadows. And tonight she chose to step. As the stars rose, Clara leaned toward him, her lips finding his. Not tentative this time, not trembling. A true kiss, soft and sure. When she pulled back, she laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from her own throat in years. Jonas smiled, his hand warm against hers. See, you already know how. Clara's chest filled with something she thought she had lost forever: hope. But how will Clara and Jonas face the weight of the past that still lingers, the voices of judgment, the fear of loss, and the test of whether love can truly take root this late in life? The days rolled on with a rhythm that felt almost too good to be true. Clara found herself humming as she kneaded bread or pausing longer at the door to watch Jonas at work in the yard. He had a way of folding himself into the fabric of her life, not demanding space, but filling it all the same. And yet at night, when the lantern burned low, the old voices returned. You're too plain. You're too old. No man would ever want a barren woman. The words of her late husband, of her father, of neighbors who whispered when they thought she wasn't listening, they echoed louder than the crackle of the fire. Sometimes when Jonas's hand brushed hers across the table, warmth surged through her. But so did fear. What if she leaned too far into it only to watch it vanish? One afternoon, Clara walked into town with Jonas to trade eggs and flour. It had been months since she'd set foot on Main Street. The wooden storefronts, the dusty road, the church steeple all looked the same, but the weight in her chest made every step heavier. As they passed the mercantile, two women standing by the porch paused mid-conversation. Clara caught the look in their eyes, the smirk that curled one corner of a mouth. She heard the hiss of a whisper. That's her, the old spinster, still clinging to that farm, and now she's dragging around some drifter. Her throat closed. She lowered her gaze and quickened her step, but Jonas slowed. He glanced at the women, then back at Clara. He said nothing, simply placed himself between her and their eyes as they walked on. At the blacksmith's, Clara lingered by the wagon, while Jonas spoke with Mr. Fletcher. She thought she was safe in her silence until she felt another presence approach. Well, I'll be, a familiar voice drawled. Clara turned, her heart stumbling. It was Samuel Carter, the man her father had once tried to force her to marry. He was older now, hair thinning, belly fuller, but his eyes still held that smug gleam. Didn't think you'd still be around, Clara, Samuel said. Figured you'd have withered away by now, all alone in that house. Clara stiffened. I manage well enough. He chuckled. Oh, I can see that. Found yourself a man finally. Though looks like he's younger than you. Doesn't mind taking scraps, I suppose. The words cut sharper than she wanted to admit. Before she could reply, Jonas stepped out of the smithy. His eyes took in the scene at once, Clara's clenched jaw. Samuel's smirk. Everything all right? Jonas asked, his voice calm but firm. Samuel tipped his hat mockingly. Just catching up with an old friend. Jonas studied him, then placed his hand lightly at Clara's back. Then catch up somewhere else. She doesn't need your words. For a moment, Samuel's smile faltered. Then he muttered something under his breath and shuffled off. Clara's chest was tight as they walked away. Jonas didn't press her to speak, but when they reached the wagon, she whispered, He used to say things like that when I was younger. That I was worthless. That no man would want me. Jonas's eyes softened. And you believed him. She swallowed hard. I tried not to. But when enough people say it, you start to think maybe they're right. Jonas's hand found hers strong and steady. Clara, I've seen the way you fight for this land, the way you hold yourself with dignity no matter who's watching. That's worth more than all his words put together. Tears pricked her eyes. She wanted to believe him, but the shadows inside her weren't so easily silenced. That night, Clara sat by the fire long after Jonas had gone to the barn. The flames flickered low and she stared into them, remembering nights of silence when she prayed for something, anything to change. Now that it had, she wondered if she was brave enough to keep it. When Jonas returned, brushing hay from his sleeves, he found her still at the hearth. He knelt beside her, concern etched on his brow. "What's got you tied up tonight?" he asked gently. Clara shook her head. "It's nothing." He waited patient. He had a way of waiting that left no room for lies. Finally, she whispered, "What if they're right? What if I'm too old, too broken to build anything new?" Jonas studied her for a long moment. Then he took her hand and placed it over his heart. "Feel that it's steady because you're here. Do you think that would be true if you were broken?" Clara blinked against the sting of tears. "I don't care what they say," Jonas continued. "I don't care what you've been told. I see you, Clara. And what I see is a woman strong enough to make a man like me want to stop wandering." Her throat ached with the weight of unspoken feelings. Slowly, she leaned against him, letting his warmth steady her. But the shadows weren't done testing them. A week later, word spread that Samuel had been telling folks in town that Clara had finally snared herself a man out of pity. The gossip stung sharper than she expected. Clara wanted to retreat, to hide on her land and avoid the eyes and whispers. But Jonas wouldn't let her shrink back. "Clara," he said firmly one evening, "if you keep hiding, you're letting their lies win. You've spent your whole life letting others define you. Don't start again now." Her jaw trembled. "But what if I'm not strong enough?" Jonas cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing her cheek. "Then lean on me. That's what partnership means. We carry the weight together." For a long moment she searched his eyes, and what she found there steadied her more than any sermon ever had. That night as she lay in bed, Clara stared at the ceiling. The whispers of the past still lingered, but Jonas's voice echoed louder now. "We carry the weight together." And for the first time she realized that maybe love wasn't about being unbroken. Maybe it was about being seen, cracks and all, and still being chosen. She closed her eyes, her heart whispering a truth she hadn't dared believe before she was worthy of love. But how will Clara learn to step fully into that worth, to not only accept Jonas's love, but to claim it for herself even when the world continues to doubt her? The morning dawned crisp in gold sunlight, spilling across the valley in long, forgiving strokes. Clara stood at the window of her cabin, watching the mist curl off the fields. For years she had seen mornings just like this, and yet this one felt different. The voices of doubt still murmured in the corners of her mind, but another voice rose stronger now, Jonas's steady tone telling her she was seen, she was enough, she was worth staying for. But liberation never comes quietly. It always asks to be tested. That day the church bell rang long before noon, its hollow clang cutting through the air. Clara knew what it meant, Sunday gathering. For months she had avoided the town congregation, too weary of the stares and whispers. But Jonas stood behind her as she looked out the window, his voice gentle but resolute. "You don't have to go," he said, "but if you want to stop hiding, now's the time." Clara's hands trembled as she smoothed her dress. She was no longer young. The lines on her face carried years of sorrow and survival. But she realized those lines were proof that she had lived, endured, and kept her dignity intact. "I'll go," she whispered. The church in Dry Creek was small, its white paint peeling the cross at its steeple, leaning just slightly as if bowed by time. As Clara and Jonas walked up the steps, the crowd inside hushed. Conversations faltered, eyes turned. She felt the weight of every glance, pity, judgment, curiosity. It pressed against her ribs like iron. At the back pew, Clara hesitated. The urge to turn and flee surged hot in her chest. But Jonas's hand slipped into hers. His grip was steady, anchoring her like roots in storm soil. They walked together to the middle pew and sat down. Clara kept her chin high, though her heart thudded like a hammer. When Reverend Daniels began his sermon, his words about grace and renewal seemed to hang in the air heavier than usual. Clara wondered if he too knew what the town whispered about her. And then as the hymn ended, Samuel Carter rose from the back. His voice cut sharp through the quiet. Some folks talk about grace, he said, eyes sliding toward Clara, but some people don't deserve a seat in God's house. Not when they live in sin, dragging strangers into their shame. A murmur rippled through the room. Clara froze every nerve in her body, screaming to disappear. She felt Jonas stir beside her, but before he could rise, Clara did something she had never done in her life. She stood. The whole church went silent. Her voice trembled at first, but it steadied with each word. I have lived 50 years being told I was less, that I was too plain, too old, too barren, that I was unworthy of love, unworthy of respect, unworthy of even sitting here. She turned her gaze, sweeping the room, finding familiar faces, women she'd grown up with, men who had laughed at her father's cruel jokes, children who only knew her as the spinster at the edge of town. But I am still here, she said, her voice gaining strength. I kept my home when others said I'd lose it. I worked the land with my own hands. And when the world told me I wasn't worth loving, God still woke me every morning with breath in my lungs. That is worth something. That is enough. A hush fell deeper. Even Samuel's smug expression faltered. Jonas rose, then not towering, not threatening, but steady. And I'll tell you what else is enough. This woman, Clara, has more strength in her than any man I've met on the trail. She doesn't need your approval, but she has my respect in my heart. And that won't change because of your gossip. Gasps whispered through the crowd. Some looked away in shame. Others nodded faintly as though something long buried had been named aloud. Samuel opened his mouth to retort, but the Reverend raised a hand. That's enough, he said firmly. The Lord's house is not for ridicule. Sit down. Samuel's face burned red as he sank back into his seat. Clara's knees shook as she sat again, Jonas's hand warm against hers. Her heart still raced, but inside she felt something she hadn't known in decades release. After the service, whispers still followed her as she walked out, but they were different this time. Not cruel, but awed. Some women even touched her arm softly as she passed, their eyes shining with something like respect. Outside, the sunlight was brighter than when they'd arrived. Clara breathed deep, the air cool and fresh in her chest. Jonas helped her down the steps, but she barely leaned on him. You were braver than I've ever seen anyone, he said quietly. She turned to him, her eyes glistening. For the first time in my life, I didn't let them speak for me. I spoke for myself. Jonas smiled, a rare, unguarded smile that lit his whole face, and I've never been prouder. That evening, they sat on the porch together. The sky blushed pink as the sun dipped low. Clara leaned against Jonas's shoulder, her heart lighter than it had been in years. For so long, she had carried chains forged from words, shame, and silence. Today, she had laid them down, and though the future was still uncertain, for the first time, it was hers to claim. But how will Clara and Jonas move forward now that she has finally spoken her truth aloud? Will the town accept them? Or will new challenges rise to test their bond? Winter loosened its grip slowly that year. The snow retreated from the ridges, trickling down into the creek that cut behind Clara's cabin, and the first shoots of green dared to push through the thawing soil. Clara stood one morning on her porch, mug of coffee warming her hands, and listened to the sound of meltwater rushing free. She thought about the sermon weeks ago, about standing in that crowded church with every eye on her, about finally saying what she had buried all her life. The memory still made her chest flutter, but now it was not fear, it was pride. Behind her, Jonas stepped out, adjusting his suspenders, his hair damp from the basin. He leaned on the rail beside her, squinting into the sunlight. Ground softening. Good time to start a new garden bed. Clara smiled. I was thinking the same. It was strange, she thought, how quickly he had become part of her mornings, her rhythm. The man who once had been a stranger with dust on his boots now knew where she kept the sugar tin, which fence posts leaned after a storm, and how to make her laugh when the weight of silence grew too heavy. The children of Dry Creek, those who used to whisper cruel nicknames behind her back now, sometimes came running past her fence. Clara had started leaving cookies on a plate near the gate. At first, they only took the sweets, darting away like sparrows. But one afternoon, a small boy lingered. Miss Clara, he asked, his cheeks pink. Is it true you fought the sheriff with just words? She chuckled softly. Not fought him, no. I just remembered I had a voice. The boy grinned, gap-toothed, and said, "Pa says that's harder than a gun sometimes." Clara ruffled his hair, her heart swelling. Perhaps the town had not changed overnight, but something had shifted like thawed ice cracking to make room for the river underneath. One evening, Jonas hitched up the wagon and took Clara out toward the western ridge. He had been quiet all afternoon, almost nervous, and Clara wondered if she had missed something in his eyes. When they reached the ridge, the view opened wide mountains, dusted with snow valleys, greening with spring. The sun set slow, draping the land in molten gold. Jonas pulled the wagon to a stop and helped Clara down. "Why here?" she asked. He looked out over the horizon, then back at her. His voice was low but certain. "Because this is the place I want you to remember if you ever wonder why I stayed." Her breath caught. "Jonas." He removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "I'm not a man with much to offer. No fine land, no cattle herd, no promises of riches. But I've seen enough roads to know I don't need them. What I need," his eyes searched hers, "is someone who knows what it means to stay when it matters. Someone who sees me past the dust and scars." Tears blurred Clara's vision. She had dreamed of words like this, but never dared to hope. "And you think that's me?" "I don't think," Jonas said gently. "I know." The wind carried the scent of pine and earth. Clara pressed a hand to her chest, steadying the storm of feeling there. For so long she had been called unwanted, too plain, too barren, too old. And yet here stood a man who saw her not for what she lacked, but for who she was. She reached out, taking his hand. "Then let's start slow. Together." Jonas's eyes softened. He bent, not rushing, not claiming, but meeting her halfway. Their kiss was quiet, tender, steady, the kind that felt less like fire and more like home. In the weeks that followed, life did not become perfect. There were fences to mend storms, to brace against gossip, still curling like smoke in the corners of town. But Clara no longer faced it alone. Jonas was beside her, not shielding her from the world, but walking through it with her. Neighbors who once turned away now nodded in greeting. Some even came to ask Jonas's help with livestock or Clara's advice about gardens. It wasn't acceptance all at once, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, Clara realized, could come even at 50. Even after years of silence and sorrow. One night as rain drummed steady on the roof, Jonas asked her softly, "Do you regret not having children?" Clara thought long before answering. The ache of that truth had haunted her most of her life, but now sitting by the fire with Jonas's hand wrapped around hers, she felt something different. "No," she said at last. "Because if I had, maybe I wouldn't have been here to meet you." And this, she squeezed his hand, "this feels like enough." Jonas pressed her hand to his lips. More than enough. Spring turned to summer, their days filled with small labors, planting, mending, sharing meals, walking into town side by side. Their love grew not with grand gestures, but with simple constancy, like the steady flow of the creek that watered Clara's garden. One evening, as they watched fireflies flicker in the dark, Clara leaned into Jonas and whispered, "You know, I was afraid I'd die without ever being kissed. Now I think I'll live remembering how gentle it felt when you kept your promise." Jonas smiled in the dark, his arm tightening around her shoulders. Slow was worth it, and together they sat in the hush of the Wild West night, no longer lonely, no longer unwanted, but finally profoundly home. And so ends Clara's long journey from silence to love, from exile to belonging. But in the untamed Wild West, every ending is only the start of another story. Would you like to hear what happens next in their quiet life together? Or perhaps another tale of second chances waiting just beyond the horizon? In the quiet glow of that prairie night, Clara's whispered truth, "I've never been kissed," was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something tender and new. And Jonas's simple reply, "Let's start slow," was more than an invitation to love. It was a promise that healing does not have an age limit. Their story reminds us that no matter how many years we've carried silence, loneliness, or rejection, there can still be moments when life leans in gently and says it's not too late. Love in its truest form doesn't rush or demand. It waits, it honors. It begins again, even at 50, 60, or beyond. And perhaps that is something we can all hold on to, that it is never foolish to hope, never too late to open our hearts, and never too old to be chosen for exactly who we are. As you reflect on Clara's journey, ask yourself, have you ever felt that love might have passed you by? What if the truth is your story is still being written? If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, share it with someone who needs hope today, and leave a comment below. Would you like to see more stories like Clara and Jonas's tender tales of late-blooming love on the Western frontier? Your voice matters here just as much as theirs did.